Welcome everyone to Managing Madness for our first hour special or hour-ish special. We'll see how that goes.
Heavy on the
Um,
ish.
yeah, but we'll be discussing religion. It's one of our largest differences. You could easily say that. But it's also a big area, I think I could say, for both of us that has grown and changed throughout our life a lot. So we'll discuss a little bit about that, how it's impacted us as adults, how it impacted us as children, and some of the things that we still kind of struggle with the idea around religion and things like that. So, would
To
you like to?
introduce ourselves.
Oh, yes. So I'm Adrian. How did I start this off with?
You went right into religion. It's
There we go.
perfect.
So, welcome to Managing Madness with Adrian
Carolyn.
and yes, I might actually be able to move that back. Actually,
It's
our whole
it's fine
intro.
if you can't. I think it's
Yeah.
perfect.
um. So to kind of start us off, we'll go a little bit into just kind of our histories with religion. Do you want to start us off on what that has looked like from, I guess, your early childhood
Sure.
to now? Just
Yeah. Um yeah. So I was raised in a home where I think I've mentioned before, my dad got sober before I was 6 and never relapsed, but was active in AA until he died a couple years ago. My mom has been super involved in Al Anon for, I think, gosh, like 35 years. I forget which chip she just recently got. Um, so there was very much like a belief in a higher power in my home. But there wasn't a lot of conversation about it. There wasn't a lot of uh, cultural, what am I, like traditions surrounding it or anything like that. We
like no
did, we
Sunday. Did you do Sunday mass?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Sunday what? Yeah. No, we called ourselves Creasters because we went to church on Christmas and Easter. Those were the only two
Okay.
days of the year that my family went to church. Um, and maybe not even Easter, just kind of depended on what was going on. But
All right.
definitely Christmas Eve. Like we always went on Christmas Eve because they had the candlelight service and we could play with the wax.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of memories surrounding that. Anyways, I throughout high school had just really been open to exploring my spirituality. Had like was really drawn to like horoscopes and like the moon and different cycles of the moon and just faith and hope in general. I did start playing basketball. I feel like that's kind of like a big like what's the word, like stereotypical thing, but I did really then start, and not even really then, I started questioning my sexuality. But I go back to even like in 6th grade, walking out of middle school, being convinced I was going to be the only girl that was ever attracted to other girls. Like that was my like, I had no idea there was like a name for it. I had no idea it. Yeah, so that's probably a whole nother episode. um, but anyways, as I started playing basketball, obviously like homosexuality was very prevalent in that community. So I started dating some of my teammates, and I mean, as much as you can in high school. But I remember when I was trying to decide which college to go to. Um, I went on 2 official visits. One was to the University of North Texas, and one was to Portland State. And leading up to that point, I just felt like very strongly like a heavy sense of God or something just weighing in my life. Like I remember one night like crying and just feeling really confused and not sure what to do. And I just felt like this prompting, like, go find a Bible. And I was like, a Bible? Like, do we even have a Bible in my house? So I like got out a flashlight. I'm like looking amongst the shelves. I found this Bible that my dad's grandma had given him when he went to college in 1970. And I just started reading through the Psalms. And I was like, this is what I'm missing. Like this is it. So when I went to North Texas, like I knew it was in the Bible Belt, even though my recruiting visit was highly questionable with the things I was exposed to. I knew like Texas in and of itself was like Southern Bible Belt ish. And then I went to Portland State, and even though I really loved like the teammates, the experience, the city, I like it's right downtown. Like it's such a cool location. Um, don't mind the puppy. Uh,
Those are quite contrasting dynamics, though.
so such a difference. But I just very much felt like I wanted to pursue whatever this was that was like stirring within me. And I do often go back to like what would have happened if I had chosen Portland State, where like, you know, in the Pacific Northwest and like a lot more liberal and
Hmm.
open and uh, anyways, so I chose to commit to the University of North Texas, moved to Denton. I was actually encouraged by one of my really good friends at the time to like journal my faith journey, which is so interesting because they since have kind of done a transition and are non-binary and um, I mean it totally makes sense. Um, but I
Are
very
they
much
still, and you don't have to disclose, but are they
mhm,
still religious or?
no,
Okay.
no, and they were raised Mormon, so their family was Mormon, but no. Again, very much open to like spirituality and growth and kindness, but like organized religion, no. Um, so anyways, they had encouraged me to journal kind of this process. So I remember even like rereading some of my journals of like, I believe in God figuratively, but like not literally. Like, how could this really happen? But as the months went on, and I mean, there's so many Christian organizations in the Bible Belt, right? So there's like, especially in college communities, like really um, and I get their heart. I do think the heart of most are like pure and kind and honest, but I also go back to like the heart of the few that becomes so loud and so dominant and so oppressive. And, you know, we'll get into that more later too. Um, anyways, but at the end of October, one of my teammates kind of, after we went to this service or whatever, I was like, I think this is what I've been missing. Like I think it's Jesus. Like
You said your
um
teammate, or is this you?
a teammate. Yep,
Okay.
one of
Uh-huh.
my friends. Uh who now is married to a woman and raising two girls together. Um but anyways, at the time, like very convicted in her like traditionally close-minded, we'll get into that later, Christianity, like what you think of when you think of like Christian culture if you're not a part of the Christian culture, like um anyways, so she like walked me through like what's known as the Romans Road and kind of like
What is
how
that? I've
it's
never even heard
there's
of
like
that.
yeah, there's several verses through the book of Romans that like walk through like how one would become saved, like kind of
Okay.
admitting that you're a sinner, that you fall short of the glory of God, recognizing that you need a savior, that Jesus died and rose again, um, and like living a life that's honorable to Him. So, anyways, I
Okay.
went back to my dorm. I like prayed the sinner's prayer, the salvation, whatever, and like it was a pivotal, like changing moment in my life. Like I very much like things seemed to make sense. Like it did feel like the answer to things that I was missing. It kind of, I could see the way that it was being taught, how it made sense that like God would want like things that are orderly and like boundaries. And anyways, it, and I mean, I still very much love Jesus and love who he himself represents. And even throughout the Bible, of like his pursuit of women, his pursuit of giving voice to the voiceless, his like just his heart for people to be like known and seen and loved. Like that's what I love about Jesus. Now, when I first became a Christian, it was definitely very much like hellfire and brimstone. Like, I have to get my family saved. Like, people are going to die. Like, and they're going to go to hell. And like, it's going to be my fault if like they don't know who Jesus is. So I'm sure my parents and my sister would have some stories. But there was a lot of trying to like convert people. I mean, I was like, very evangelical at nature, like just, I mean, airplanes, public place. I mean, I was always looking for a way to like share about Jesus and who he was and what he did in my life. And
This is around what age?
so it was 18,
Okay.
18 and a half. And then within a couple years of that, and again, this can kind of go into a separate episode, but I met this girl. I fell in love with her. I was like very conflicted with like my Christian faith versus like homosexuality. And it was this constant back and forth where I would like be so convicted at some service and then tell her that we could, you know, we had to stop this dynamic. And I mean, it got to the point where she told me that I had made her hate God. And understandably, I mean, the way that I was representing him, of the back and
Mm-hmm.
forth. Um, and then really long story short, she ended up dying in a motorcycle accident. And I felt so responsible. Like, I was like, what if I had not like pursued or been open to a relationship with her? I mean, I was very
Did you
much
feel it was
like,
God punishing the
I did,
situation? Oh,
I
okay.
did. Um, yeah, like
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I
a
could see
lot.
that. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so that's where the responsibility piece came in, of like, if I knew better and I
Right,
still like subjected her to this, like, did I kill her? Like,
right,
was
right.
I? And I mean, there's still really beautiful God pieces within that, like the pursuit that he did of her, that like my perspective is that he did of her, leading up to her death, was still pretty powerful. But there was a lot of guilt and shame and like, okay, like this needs to not be what I do. Like, I need to just pursue what God wants. Like, I never need to be with a woman again. And I remember talking to my dad one time, who again had been sober since right before I turned 6. Um, and he made the comment at the time, which is interesting. He was like, Carolyn, it's a decision that I make every single day to remain sober. And I was like, what if this is a decision that I have to make every single day to pursue God rather than pursue a relationship with a woman or just do something that's more comfortable or whatever? And that was like altering to me. And it's interesting because like later, like years later, when my dad and I would talk about that, he didn't remember that conversation because he's like, oh no, I can go like months not even thinking about my sobriety. You know, even though he would like do, I was like, that's so funny because it was like such a like pivotal. And we were at the Gompers campus. Like, I remember
Hmm.
being on the cell phone with him. Um, but I was like, okay, like maybe I just like white knuckle it for a while and just every day decide I'm going to pursue Jesus instead of like whatever my desires might be. So, anyway, so yeah, then I moved to Los Angeles, and that felt like an answered prayer because I'd met some random Christian guy in an airport in San Francisco, and he lived like in outside of Temecula, and we're like, okay, if I get like, if I'm placed in Los Angeles, clearly we're meant to be together. This guy was
Clearly.
such a, clearly that's all you need, right? I know this is what my girlfriend says now, like, your bar is so low.
Yeah.
um,
Clearly, if I
So,
just get placed in a very heavily placed area,
yes, then it's
or
meant
the
to
most
be.
popular
I
area, like, then I
then we're meant to be together. So, anyways, I dated this guy for a while. Oh my gosh, he talk about a mess.
saying,
Finally, got the gumption to break up with him. He was. I hope he's doing well, but it was not a good fit. um. So, anyways, then I kind of took that as like I need to like wholeheartedly pursue God, like figure out what he wants for my life, and this is like around the time that we were getting super close too. And I remember one of your biggest things being like, you say your God is a good God, and like opening the door out onto the campus and being like, how can a good God allow something like this, right? As we worked in
mm-hmm,
this super impoverished school with kids just like at the mercy of impoverished parents doing the best that they could, but still just so riddled with addiction and I mean just so many stories, right?
yeah,
Um,
in a terrible just so many systemic issues and
so many
injustices.
systemic issues, yeah,
Yeah.
and oppression. And I mean, I remember our students when I was going back to like recruit for Teach for America, and them being like, when I asked them like, "What do you want me to tell them? What should?" And they're like, "Well, just let them know that here in the middle class, we." And I'm like, "I'm sorry, what? You, you, this, this is not middle class." And they just had no idea. And I didn't know
Well,
if that was like good or bad or I but I think it's bad. I think it's
well,
bad that they would.
I mean,
What do
it's
you?
just, and I don't know if we've discussed it, but I thought growing up I was middle class until I met Teach for America, and that's what I was like, oh, no, no, no,
Oh,
I'm not near middle class. Like
isn't
I'm what would be considered poor. Okay, I got it. Like I did, but it didn't hit me till then, as an
yeah, but
adult. So
yeah. So maybe that could be another episode
that's a
of
whole
like,
nother conversation. But that was something for me too. I thought I was middle class because I had every video game and I had juice.
yeah,
I had 100% juice, and I didn't know anyone else around me that really had 100% juice. So I thought I had made it to middle class somehow.
yeah.
But
Isn't
well,
that
that's
crazy?
definitely a deeper,
But
yeah,
I did, yeah,
conversation.
that add that to the list because I did feel that it was a disservice that our students thought that that was middle class. And I was like, no, no, no. Like, this does not exist in middle class. Like, the conditions that you're exposed to, the fact that you have not had like a consistent English teacher all year because we can't hire anybody, like, this would not ever fly in middle class, like, ever.
Right.
Um, so again, but I don't know. I mean, I remember one of my students who was like the most, what's the word, like formidable, or like the one that changed me the most, saying like, imagine if there was a place that you could go on a jog at night.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's like everywhere I've ever lived. I could go on a jog at night. But she literally had no idea that that could even be a thing, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really, I think it, like, my mom kind of functioned under the MO, like, if they're old enough to ask, they're old enough to know. So if you're old enough to have a thought, you're old enough to, like, be challenged on that.
Yeah,
Anyways,
that's
I
that's a
know,
little because
right?
kids have a lot of
That,
thoughts, and it doesn't. That'll kind of go into our conversation too
yeah,
with today
yeah.
with
But,
religion.
like, could it lead to, like, just asking questions? Not, like,
Yeah.
necessarily challenge, but, like expand more. Anyways, so this is kind of going into my blah, 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 me and my summarizing. Um, anyway, so then I started dating a guy at Gompers.
So.
You're very familiar with, and we spent a couple years dating, but it was not like we never even talked about marriage. It was like very surface
Mm.
level. I mean, kind enough. Like it was
And the
fine.
big thing again with this guy is Christian. So
Yeah.
going back to
But he like culturally said he was a Christian. But some of my friends, when I was like, I don't know, it's like not a huge part of his life, like because he didn't go to church.
hmm
And my friends were like, but is there fruit in his life? Like that was the big question. Like, is there evidence of his faith in his life? And I was like, well, like, I mean, he's working at Gompers. He's like kind. He, cares about these kids, even though it comes across pretty crass sometimes. Oh, goodness. Anyways, finally broke up with him and decided to go to this discipleship program in San Diego because I'm like, I don't know why I believe what I believe. Like, I just became a believer when I was an adult. I mean, barely an adult. And it's just kind of, but so many people who were like raised in the church or raised in religion, like knew so much more than I did. And I was like, I kind of need to know like why I believe what I believe. So it was actually a really powerful year. I loved it. I loved the things that I got to learn. I was living in San Diego with a bunch of my friends who, I mean, we did like a Bible study on like restoring sexual identity because a lot of us were like trying to convert from homosexuality or bisexuality or whatever non-hetero normative stuff. Which is funny then looking at where we've all ended up. Anyways, but through that time,
And just because I mean it's highlighted, and I think it's also entwined because that will be a component I'll also mention of how much religion has brought in just its own challenge, just for even the challenge of a queer identity, of how much like additional challenge trying to be Christian has brought onto that,
yeah,
and adding that. But
yeah,
I
and
just wanted to
yeah,
mention because we are discussing religion, but a lot of it has been around identity and dating and who
yeah.
you've done. So just how much of that has
Well,
been a
and that is
conflict and a
has been
challenge.
kind of the dominant thing in my life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of like, with girls through high school and then feeling really conflicted and then like coming to like know and love Jesus and being like this I cannot will not like this cannot be what God's best for me is to then we'll get to where I am now. But anyway, so I
But kind
like
of equating as heterosexuality being God's way.
God's way, the right way, like
Mm-hmm.
God's best, God's design. Yes, very much so. Um, so while I was in that discipleship program, I very much like started like praying and fasting for a husband, um, and just desiring like a family and kids and just very much like the stereotypical like American dream, um, well, for at least for like white heterosexual people. Um,
And don't get
so
too deep into the challenges because we're still on kind of your summary.
okay.
Just
Oh, my
letting you know.
summary 30 minutes later.
This
We're
is
like
supposed to
still
be.
talking.
Well,
I
we
mean, it's so many layers, right?
yeah. So
But
kind of in all of that, where are you now in your faith? Where would you
yeah.
consider? Do
So
you still consider yourself Christian?
I do. I love
Okay.
Jesus. Like
Okay.
that is kind of where I am. And I am in love with a woman. So
Okay.
I spent 13 and a half years married. There were some good times that like gave me the desire and the hope to like stay committed and faithful in that. But there was a lot of hard with somebody who like supposedly like loved and honored the Lord and like wanted to like have a God-fearing marriage and family and raise kids in the church and um so to then experience what I experienced at the hands of someone who supposedly loved God, to sit and be like, this would be God's best for me.
Right.
How does that make
Yeah.
sense? Um, so definitely in the last 6 months, I've had a huge shift, and I don't feel like in being married that I really like ever had to like compromise my sexuality. I had to compromise a lot of other areas of my life and things that I never expected to have to deal with or handle or have to like persevere through. But like my sexuality not being one of them. Um, but I just so happened during our separation to go out with and then start dating and fall in love with an amazing woman, um, who was also raised in the church but had a lot more religious trauma. I mean, not also, who was raised in the church had a lot of religious trauma at the hands of people who claim to love Jesus. So is a lot more reticent towards organized religion, and although also admittedly like loves Jesus and like who he stands for at his heart, not like the people at large who represent him, which is so unfortunate to me.
But I think that was a good segue to kind of lead into where mine is, which I feel I
Mm-hmm.
have a lot more of the religious trauma. So I was raised Catholic, went to Catholic school from, my summary will be a lot shorter. Uh,
Because you're
my,
better at that than I am. I've been told since sixth grade I struggle with summarizing.
was-
Sorry,
there was so
guys.
many of the challenges we're going to discuss that you brought up in your
Yeah,
summary.
yeah,
But one of the big ones, uh, I will lead into that. But um, I believe I was even like baptized by like three priests. Like there was a big thing around my. I was heavily involved in the church. Again, my mom went to and still kind of hasn't so much since since 2020, but um, go to church daily. As I said, I went to Catholic school from kindergarten to 12th grade. It wasn't until kind of college and senior year where I started to reevaluate. For me, religion was everyone around me was just pretty much Catholic. I didn't know any other real experiences or have any real exposure to anyone else. So I just kind of was culturally by default Catholic. Like I just thought that's what we do, and that's what was the quote unquote right way to be. So there wasn't too many uh, at at the time. I really didn't think there was many challenges with my faith because I just didn't know there was any other way. A
yeah.
lot of what I've understood now things to be um, is kind of what I was going through back then. Now I'm somewhat or in college, I kind of started transitioning out of that towards more of an atheist, uh, anti-theist kind of stance, where I don't use the anti-theist position as much anymore because I'm not as invested in it energy-wise. But a lot of that was just I still do kind of have a concern for its exposure around children. And I think this is what kind of I'll start leading into where one of my resentments towards being raised religious was that I honestly do feel it taught me homophobia. And that was still something that left residue after I even left the church. So after I had already left the idea of God and religion and was no longer Catholic, I still had homophobic concepts in me from that time. And my idea really behind it was when I was younger, being taught that it was a choice. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, one of the big things was I was always one of my big goals was not to go to hell. I was actively working not to go to hell. So to me, it didn't ever make sense. And to me, I take things very logically, like or literally.
Mm-hmm.
Things need to make logical sense to me. And it did not make sense to me as to why someone would choose to go to hell, knowing how terrible a place we were being taught it was. Why would someone choose to do that? And what in retrospect now, what I think bothered me so much is I was severely depressed as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and through middle school, and I felt I was living through hell. So to me, it
Yeah,
was like, why would someone choose this? Like, I don't
yeah.
understand, and it was frustrating to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't until later in this will become like a deeper conversation, but that was even something too. Like when I started meeting some of our students uh, who were queer, did not potentially know. Now that I'm, still have conversations with some of them and didn't identify as queer at the time, but there was just something I knew they they weren't straight. I didn't know what
Yeah.
else what else was happening. I couldn't say, and I've even told them I couldn't say your identity. I didn't know what your
Mm-hmm.
identity would be. I just had a strong feeling it wasn't straight.
Hetero.
Yeah, it wasn't hetero. And me having to work through getting that out of me as to why do I have this discomfort and disdain for a population that is literally trying to love. And then, even me growing up and uh, developing and understanding just how, so I am heterosexual. Um, but just how difficult making a relationship is, how challenging that is, and how difficult it is to find love. Why would someone finding love offend me so much? And like a
Mhm.
lot of that was still having to get rid of the what I thought, what I believe is being taught that hatred. And I really do believe that because I've never held hatred towards any other group in my life other than that group during that time period of my life.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the only reason I was able to hold hatred towards that group is because I supposedly had a gift from above that was established that told me this was wrong. So I had my faith to justify my hatred, where
Mm.
I've never had anything else to be able to justify any other type of hatred.
Mm.
So that's where, one of the things where I've really struggled with it, and where I really worry about the dynamic that does, because it is interesting how we kind of just say, let's start off with like a summary of where we've gone through faith, but of how intertwined, again, this podcast is about,
Sexuality in general.
right, and how that in itself is such a challenge, but how much of a greater challenge is brought in when you bring in religion as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I really worry for children experiencing that, especially queer children who are
Mm.
waking up and then being exposed to part of their identity is being told that they're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that was
and
one of my daughter's big things as it came out, just how much her dad was against and full of just judgment and hurt and hate towards the decision that I'm making. Um, where she was like, what if I'm gay? Like, is daddy gonna hate me? And I was like, I mean, I would like to think not.
mhm,
And like, I don't know.
right, we don't have the
Yeah.
evidence to say
I mean, I
otherwise.
have friends raised in a church who flat out have said if their kids come out as queer of any sort that they would have to cut off communication with them.
Hmm.
I'm like, how does this make sense?
And as we're going into kind of challenges uh with Christianity, that's where I really struggle a
Mm.
lot, being formally Catholic and having had been taught the Bible for even 12 years of school. I had a religion class. I had
Mm-hmm.
a class every quarter, every semester, every year. There was always part of one of my subjects was
Mm-hmm.
something around religion. So I
Mm-hmm.
know this religion. So now living in as an atheist kind of in the society where I struggle a lot knowing the Bible, of what I remember most about being Christian and Catholic was loving others. That was like the core, you know, love God above all things, love your neighbor above all things. Those were like the two sacred those were like, if you forget about everything else, remember those two. And how often that is forgotten amongst Christians,
Yes.
especially as we've mentioned in the podcast, we're talking about a lot American society, um, American Christians, of how
Yeah.
that is often so forgotten, in my
But
opinion.
and yes, and one thing that you said to me that has really stood out to me is like, okay, if you look at like religions across the world or like Jesus, like one of the big things that Christianity has that other religions don't is like Jesus rose from the dead, right? And like,
There's a lot
and
of religions that have a
a
resurrection.
risen Lord. Okay. So, but
A
even
lot.
about the resurrection, so even with that, like, you had made the comment, like, why do Christians focus so much about the death on the cross
Hmm.
rather than what would be considered supernatural? Like, everybody dies, but
Yep.
like what would be considered supernatural of like his resurrection? Like, why is
I,
Easter
I,
not?
I said that.
Yes.
I don't remember that.
I know, but
Okay.
like I think about it often, especially around Easter, because I'm like, yes, it like if as Christians, like we believe the power comes from like the resurrection and Jesus rising again, like why is that not what's like totally celebrated rather than like him just being born Christmas, like him
Yeah.
just dying, like, but like why is Easter not like culturally the
Bigger.
biggest celebration of what Christians have? Anyways,
Yeah, I can see that.
yeah, we had that conversation, and I was like,
One
so
Well, one
good.
of the big things that I really developed even early on is I was being depressed and,
Mm,
wanting to die. I
yeah,
was never impressed as a child with the death of Jesus. That was
yeah.
never impressive to me because it was something I desired. And it was something I would even say, like, easily do that to me and I'll die.
Mm,
Part of my story was when I was 12, in my depression, I would pray every single night to die that
mm,
night because I was so tired of living that every single
mm,
night I would pray to die. Uh and in when I'd wake up, I go, okay, I'll try again because I was taught that God put you on earth for you to live your purpose and do a certain amount of good and things like that. And I was trying to exhaust as much good as possible so that I could die as soon as possible because I really believed that God was punishing me for being born. I internalized the concept of birth was my sin, life will be my sentence, death will be my pardon. Because
mm,
there was no way an all good, all giving God would make a child, because I recognized I was a child. A child suffers so much if I hadn't messed up somewhere before. So
yeah.
since I couldn't identify a great sin in my lifetime, I figured it must have been my birth. So I must have really messed up the world balance when I was born, and I guess my life is just about suffering and things like that. Which leads to kind of my other point, because I didn't know you didn't know this story, but I also believe religion just teaches us to almost justify suffering. And I say that in that sense of that I thought I was paying a penance for something I didn't do.
Or didn't know. Yeah,
Or just being born for existing. And that does go a lot as we talking about, the queer community and things about that, how your identity can you know, the fact that like how it's hard for me to imagine, and we're discussing especially youth who don't have all of their cognitive abilities, their full brain. Sorry, when I do this, this is
yeah,
Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain.
yeah, yeah.
So you could look that
Fight or
up if you're
flight.
not
Yeah.
familiar. Yeah, but when I say that, it's like they don't have the cognitive part. They can't make sense. So they're suffering, in my opinion, and that's why for me, just speaking of me, I equated my suffering as something God wanted for me. That was part of God's plan. God was gonna make me suffer. That was something God wanted for me, because somehow I was going to be repaid later, and it's always like that concept. And so one of the big things, and this is one of the stories, and this was really deep in my development of why I never liked any of the pleasant memories or positive memories I have. So one of my memories that I remember that I held on to that I was most proud of was being kind of on the shorter, thin stature. Um, I was sometimes asked to play Jesus in, the Stations of the Cross and things like that. So there was one Easter event, which that's why it's relevant, because maybe that's why I was also connecting that too. Um, I had to kind of carry around. It was about my height, so it was around like the cross was around 6 feet. I'm not 6 feet. I'm like 5'8", but the cross was around 6 feet, and I had to carry like that wooden cross, not very heavy, around the church and things like that. While people were like, whipping me and things like that. It wasn't as like real. It was like the plastic that you put kind of over picnic tables outside, like that plasticky cloth.
Yeah.
It was that cut into strips.
Mm-hmm.
Um, But in this, at one point, they were going to go into the full like torture of Jesus. So there was going to be a point where I was going to be laying over like that cross, and then they were supposed to, really lay into me. And
Whipping you with that.
they told the soldiers to make it look real. There was a cognitive disconnect between making it look real and making it real. They laid into me, and they laid into me where it was breaking the skin on my back. I was getting whipped in front of the whole community of people. I did not break character. I stayed within the role I played. I did not know how severe it was until later I was put on what would be more so around maybe a 9 to 10 foot cross. And I was laid down on the cross, and then I was like put up, and all I had to do to hold on to the cross was two nails that I had to hold on to with fist, and then where I could put my feet was a platform, that I had to push at the tip so that it wouldn't slide down the cross. So I had to put a lot of pressure on the tip so I could have something to, or else if it moved to level, it was wider and would just slide down. It was upon that moment of putting pressure on the thing and it laying on my back that I realized how many open wounds I had on my back because the splinters were going into my whip wounds. And everybody in the church was crying because everybody could see the pain on my face. And I was still acting and doing all that, but the pain was so real because I had splinters going into empty wounds. So everybody in the church was blind because I had genuine pain in my eyes and in my face because I was in real pain. I was eventually brought off the cross and taken backstage, and it wasn't until I was taken away from the audience that I collapsed in pain and then was taken off. And then they had also thrown like red paint on me. And when they were trying to rub off the red paint, that's when they realized like I had actual blood on my back. And so my point of my story with that though is for so long I had held that as a very honorable memory. I had always thought if I could get whipped in front of a group of people and stay in character for the sake of this Christian play, I can take a lot. Was a lot of my comment. Like, I could take, and a lot of not knowing how much emotional pain really impacts us. I was like, I can deal with all the emotional stuff if I could physically. And that's why a lot, even when I was younger, the whole death of Christ really wasn't as impressive to me as someone who wanted to die and who was in constant pain. Um, but it goes back to it really it wasn't until about, and that's why I say, even though I haven't been Catholic since I was like 20, now being like 41, I still have a lot of Christian residue, no other word to call it, was that of I still had, because of Christianity, I had a lot of honor around suffering. And that whole idea, it wasn't until 2 years ago that I realized, and it was something I had to bring up in therapy, that I didn't deserve to get whipped in front of a church for a play. I didn't deserve that. I should have said stop. I should have stopped the play and said stop. But something in my faith, the way I was taught, the way I was told to serve, the way I was to display my faith, taught me to suffering was part of my story. This was what God wanted for me. And this goes into kind of also where in separating myself from the church of how another thing I really challenge is my ancestors. So I've gone into my ancestors' Mexican culture, really believe in the three roots of Mexican culture being the indigenous people who lived on the land, the African people who were brought to were enslaved, but brought to build upon the land, who built upon the land, some of them escaping slavery and building their communities in Mexico, and the Spanish who colonized the land.
Hmm.
Only one of those roots got a choice in which religion they chose. Two of them didn't. And that's one thing where I think about my roots of my African ancestry and indigenous ancestry. My faith for my mother is so important, and part of that is so important because my ancestors had to
Had no
raise us
choice.
Christian, and all our other beliefs and all that had to, because how are you supposed to tell a kid, okay, when we're out of our house, we say Jesus, we love Jesus, but culturally we actually still believe in this and we still believe in nature, and you can't tell a kid that because they're going to slip up, and that literally meant death for two two of my roots, two of my ancestral roots. That literally meant death. That choice to continue their culture literally meant death for them or their kids.
Yeah, their faith system, their hope, yeah.
Their whole culture. And so that's where I reflect upon too how Christianity, and one of the big things too, where when I started separating from the faith, is like, how are you going to be Mexican and not be Christian or Catholic? Like as if the two couldn't exist separately. But it is part of that whole existence of why is it part of Mexican culture? Like in going back into that, did we
Yeah,
have a
life or
choice
death.
in this? Yeah. Like only a certain group had a choice in this. And it wasn't, the group that I personally try to connect with most, that I feel most connected with. Uh so about that and how like that's where a lot of the challenges come for me too, bringing it back to like my culture of seeing that and how I see it in a lot of communities of color. and how I see, well, like, God has a plan. And it's just like, I saw a meme the other day where it says like, I am such a better planner than God, because it says like, it had person, and it says like my goal, and then it said plan, and it was like a straight line, and then it showed God's plan, and it showed like attacks, like people, like
Yeah.
ditches, like spikes, and it was like, why is God's plan always has to include all this suffering, just to? But I when I was Christian, I would justify that. Oh, this is part of God's plan, because when I die, um, I'll get rewarded. And going into kind of even the story of our kids, and why I would even open the door of like, I can't ever, and this is where I am too, where if I believed in a God, I would only believe it to hate it, because I cannot. Uh, I can accept an idea that maybe some cosmic being started this all. You can call it the Big Bang, whatever started it, and then just let it be. Let it be. Randomness and coincidence and chance happen that created everything else after that. I can buy that if that's someone's idea of a creator. I cannot accept an idea of an active God, because I cannot believe an active, all powerful, almighty God would allow children to suffer. So if I do believe in a God, for me, the only understanding is that God chooses to let children suffer. And in that case, I hate that God.
Yeah.
So that's why
See, yeah, and
the
that
only
gets
way I
so.
would be able to, yeah, believe in a God is to hate it. And that's why I also
Hmm.
choose my position where I don't want to hate something.
Yeah.
Because I just don't think it exists. But go ahead.
I think it's so tricky because, right, Christianity and the Bible itself would like explain away like why these bad things can happen, of like that we will never. Yeah,
But
it gets messy.
but
And
this is where we go. Where I loved how you said that, because in part of, as we're going to go through it was that Bible was used to explain
mm,
why certain of my ancestors were enslaved.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
It was
mm-hmm,
used to explain why certain of my ancestors didn't deserve what others of my other
mm-hmm.
branch of my ancestry did. The one that happened to be a fairer skin.
Have lighter. Yeah,
Right.
totally.
And it's
I
still, that's where it's still like, it's often, it has, it allows a justification of hatred. And it
Yeah.
has historically for so long. Um,
And that
it's challenging.
is, yeah, I see that, and I've watched a lot of friends on faith journeys, especially friends of color, that it has like just brought up so much like awareness of the oppression that religion has allowed. um, and that's a hard pill to swallow, right? Especially as someone who's raised like upper middle class, white. I will always be straight passing. Um, so I have like very much aware of the privilege that I have, and even, but I don't know how really to like honor that, or I mean, I just feel like that means that I need to like be really intentional in my advocating and standing up on behalf of people whose voices are minimalized just because of what they look like. Um, but I think about like my girlfriend's experiences and how much she's had to fight for these rights, especially of like the queer community, where I'm like, yeah, I spent the last almost 15 years of my life living like a very heteronormative existence where I didn't like, although I can like post these posts and engage in dialogue and, have like challenging conversations within my sphere of influence, I haven't had to do some of the hard work, and nor probably will I ever. Like, so how do I then give voice to, well, also, like, I do love who, like, Jesus at his core represents and what he himself did biblically, historically. I mean, it's like, but the friends that I follow and the public figures that I follow are like very much more progressive um in their belief system, and like Jen Hatmaker, for example, She and her now ex-husband, but when their daughter came out, spent years studying the Bible and like what God truly said about um, homosexuality, and their findings were like, when you look at like the roots of what were going on when it talks about homosexuality, it was really like the intent of what God was not, what's the opposite of condoning, of like totally against,
Condemning.
yeah, condemning, thank you, was pedophilia, which I am like totally on board with.
Yeah.
Right, like we are against that.
Yeah.
um so of like older adults or men or whatever, like, grooming and pursuing people that whose minds are not developed. And yeah, I'm against that. So anyways, that's what they found throughout their years of study, was that like when you look at like the Greek words of what was spoken, because I feel like Christians use like 3 verses to like condemn homosexuality, um but that really what it meant was pedophilia.
But
um
re- really quickly to me, and that's why, and this is going back to, I know a lot of, I was literally taught religion, for 12 years
mm-hmm,
in school.
mm-hmm,
That doesn't take away from what my mom was teaching me and how much, religion is a presence in my, my parents' home and things like that and in my family. But as I'm hearing you say that, what my question is, why does there need to be so much work on either end to justify or to condone or condemn uh, the queer community, when why can't we just, why are we always bypassing the start of love one another?
yeah,
Like, that's why I was
I
just, why does it have to, where's there
I'm
deeper research
yeah,
needed when we
yeah,
can just go at the very core of love? When I can't get to homophobia
yeah,
and
if I'm just loving
acknowledge that.
people.
Yeah, if I'm
Yeah,
loving people, I can't get to that conclusion. I
yeah,
don't care what the text comes after. I can't lost. So that's where it's interesting to me of how,
mm,
why a lot of these details and how that core of my understanding
mm,
of when I was taught that core fundamental rule in Christianity, how it gets bypassed so quickly and gets, get caught up in the weeds of a lot of these other things, when it's just like, what about the first one? Like, what about the
yeah,
giant sign in
just
front
stay
that
here.
says, hey, love one another? Why are we
Yeah,
even getting into the house of hate and trying to
yeah,
find rooms that allow us to justify hatred or allow us to be
mm.
against a certain thing but still not hate it or whatever? The big sign out front says, love one another. Like, how did we not pay attention to that?
That's so interesting too, because as we all know, this is Pride Month. So we brought my younger kids to the Pride Parade that was downtown this weekend, and it was just so sweet to like watch my kids engage with and like, just high five. And I mean, there's probably over. I mean, we're a pretty small town compared to Los Angeles.
And yeah,
Um, but we had like probably 40 or 50 different organizations that were in the parade and just doing I mean, so much engagement. And like to watch my son and like his awareness, and then to look at my girlfriend with my daughter sitting on her lap and just saying, when I was your age, like never did I ever dream something like this could exist. And I was like, when I was your age, I thought I was the only one who even liked people of the same gender. This was a thing. But there were a couple groups that came by that my daughter was like, are, are they going to heaven? Like, would they, and I was like, oh my, I said, here's the deal. Like, I love God and I love what he has done in my life, and I don't know other people's hearts. And like, it's not my job to judge them. Like, but I want to talk to them and like understand their belief system, even if I don't believe it. Cause she came home kind of like, wait, so you believe in witchcraft? And I was like, I believe in it. Yeah. Do I practice it? No. Am I going to judge someone for practicing it? No. I'd love to hear like what their thought system was around that. Like, and is it my job as another human being to pass judgment on that? And again, I know we'll get, if there are like some hardcore Christians that listen to this, I'm sure there'll be a lot of scriptures coming, but that is just not, I just want my kids to like, and kind of what you had said too of being raised in the church and how that led to like so much homophobia and like allowed for this hatred. That is one of my concerns with having raised kids in the church. And I mean, my oldest isn't even speaking to me right now because I'm a homosexual adulteress.
Well,
um
sorry,
yeah,
I didn't mean
so
to cut you off with that.
yeah, I see how much religion allows for hate.
And so and that goes up to a a big point as to my concern with it, and that's why I love that the concept of being spiritual is on the
Mm-hmm.
rise more, where people are starting to identify themselves more as spiritual versus in, because in that sense I've never met two identical Christians. It's
Right,
all
right.
how everyone interprets their faith, and everyone has kind of this. So the fact that we still end up grouping ourselves into these teams is weird to me. I really do like the
Mm-hmm.
idea that everyone's faith and spiritual journey is an individual journey.
Mm-hmm.
um but one of the things I go into, and that is where I kind of do have more of an anti-theist stance, and my concern about religion being taught to children is it is such a complicated topic. Like literally, religion has been debated since the dawn of time. It is one of the things that humans have never been able to agree upon. It has changed, it has evolved, it is constantly discussed. Philosophy constantly discusses and things like that. Yet we teach our kids, but we don't want to show them sex. We don't want to show them, violence.
And
We
like
want
in the
to,
Christian culture, you better not be okay with sex until you get married, and you better be like
right.
all okay with it.
So, and they don't even need to hear about that stuff until they're 18 or older. Let's keep them away from that, those
But let them
concepts.
watch porn and
But,
learn that up.
but yeah, I mean, they're going to have to do that. But yeah, let them create the shame behind that, because, but, um,
That
yet
won't ruin my marriage.
we expose them to this concept of eternal damnation in your afterlife,
Mm.
because that's part of where it's like you're literally, we're telling kids what you do in your life determines what happens to you when you're dead. How is that not an extremely complex concept for a child to possibly how is that not more complicated than sex or
Yeah,
violence? Like
right.
but that's why we have culturally in society, we want to keep our children from some of these quote unquote adult topics. I don't know how religion made it in that, because also if we're
Yeah,
talking about violence and sex, read the Bible.
yeah. Good old Testament.
Yeah, read the
Well,
Bible. That
I
book is
saw
brutal.
it's
Like,
terrible,
so it's
right?
just like, but it's
Women
okay.
gone, kids
But
gone.
but it's
Like,
okay, and we want to expose kids to that, and that's where, to me,
mm,
that's where I that's one of my biggest challenges and my concern of what are we doing to children, and also one of the bigger concerns, as we're talking about too, the impact to just how it, in my opinion, helps continue a patriarchy, because often God is referred
mm,
to as he or him,
mm-hmm.
and this idea of where we're teaching young girls that the ultimate image is a he or him. I think that is harmful.
Yeah, add that to the list of things we
Yeah.
can talk about. One of the things that I saw that I really liked, this little meme, was like, okay, so we're like teaching our kids it's okay to like hide under desks or like be silent in the corner of a classroom in case of an active shooter or whatever, but like we can't tell them that Johnny has two dads. Like, where is our priority? Like, how are we so afraid of, like, in the whole like banning book thing, like, is this really
Yeah.
contagious? Like, come on. Like,
But
and that was kind of my mom's biggest thing of why would someone choose something that's like so hated if this is, and I've never considered, I mean, I've just kind of always considered myself bisexual. Like, I've never, and sexuality wasn't like a huge part of my identity, like who I loved. I love so many people, you know this. So it wasn't like,
but
even my girlfriend's dad was like, let them know you for you. Like, you don't need to just be known as being gay. Like, let them know, but I do feel like because it's such an oppressed community, so much of the identity around being gay does come to the forefront. It's
that's
tricky.
why, in the same regard of where I think about that, if you can't let people know you're gay, why do you have to tell them you're Christian too? Why can't they
Yeah.
see that you're Christian? Like that's
Yeah.
where it's one of the
Well,
things
and
too,
that's the
where it's
thing
just
too.
like,
So one of my girlfriend's friends was in town from out of state, and I had just come from a church group, and I was like, I love Jesus, but I'm in love with this woman, you know.
mhm.
But that statement alone, like, made this friend like very much shut down to me because of the religious trauma that she's experienced at the hands of people who say they love Jesus. Like,
And,
whereas had I not said that, but spent the weekend with her, I know I would have won her over.
well, because the big thing to me is where I get frustrated as an atheist is stop telling me you're Christian, show me, be Christ-like. Let me, because that goes into the thing where I also have a trouble. Oftentimes, working in communities of color, I'm often told, "Oh, you're doing Jesus's work or God's work," and it's like, "No, I'm actually not a believer. You are now, but Jesus
Yeah,
is
but
in
he's
you."
in you.
Yeah, it's like, okay, let's, and that's why having been Christian before, I take offense to that. And someone actually was like, no, they mean that in a good way. I know they mean that in a good way, but they are also trying to recruit me on their team because they are trying to take what I do that they view as God's work, and they're trying to give their God credit for what I do. And
Yeah.
that's where it's just like I also get
Huh?
a bit stop trying to give God all the good stuff and like
And
then
not make him
it's
accountable for the hard stuff
yeah,
or the
and
bad stuff. Yeah.
it's humans fault for all the bad stuff, and that's where I
Mm,
go into it. If you're if if my suffering is part of my that has come from part of my decisions or whatever, then so does my effort, so does my pride. The good
mm,
that is in me, I deserve to take credit for that. I don't have to give it to this other being, and I don't believe anybody else has the right to take that credit from me and give it to their team or their God. And I find that very prevalent where it's just, but it's like that. It's just like, to me, the way I take it is like, you need to do that because you're not showing enough of an example, maybe. Because then you
yeah.
could point to your actions and say, like, this, look at my
This
work.
is
And
what
people
God
would be saying it
does.
about
Yeah.
you. You don't need to
Yeah.
take my stuff. But that's where it's
Interest.
just,
Yeah.
it's, it's strange to me. And that's where it just goes back to one of the interesting things that I wanted to mention of how there's this lack of reflection that I feel that sometimes religion can give people. And one of the I believe is like when in discussing gay marriage when it came up in California, uh, you know, just marriage, but allowing everybody to get married when that could become a topic, and my mom kind of having an issue with it. And me, the question I ultimately pose is, how does that affect your marriage?
Yeah.
Because one of the things too, and my parents'
I'm
marriage
like,
was
let's
not a
look how
happy
many
one.
Christians' marriage actually reflect like
Well,
what
that's what I'm
Jesus in the
saying.
church.
My parents' marriage was not a happy marriage. And that's what I told my mom. Do you think your marriage was a good reflection of the institution of marriage? But somehow you have a problem with two other people who generally
Who
love
love each
themselves.
other
Yeah,
and like have
this
to fight to have a
yeah, like
family and have to.
they love each other so much they're willing to deal with your BS to
Mhm.
be themselves. They love each other that much and you have an issue with that. What is your problem?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's where it became. That's where my mom reflected, and she's like, "Yeah, you're right. Like
Yeah.
I am
Who would
literally
want?
hating
And that's what makes me so
love."
sad too when I think about so many. I mean, I think about my own marriage, and I think about so many of my friends' marriages of like, biblically, a marriage is supposed to represent like Christ in the church and like be self-sacrificial and serve one another. But I feel like so often that falls on one partner because another partner is like choosing, like in my case, a decade of whatever the hell he wanted to do.
And,
But I was a Christian, so I was expected to like forgive him and still like honor our marriage. But I
and
spent
what would I say? And do you think there's also patriarchy in that as being the woman and the wife
very
of
much so.
being your role to forgive your
Yeah.
husband in
Where
his
even though I
journey?
do think we're coming a long way in a
But
lot of churches, not all,
uh-huh.
of like recognizing women as like an equal, but I mean, I think there always will always in religion be like a man, but like, okay, so I'm married to a man where I'm still the breadwinner, I'm still the spiritual leader, and like having to forgive upon forgive upon forgive, and now he's being praised by people because he's posting all these things about what happens when you're so hurt by somebody you love, and I'm like,
Yeah.
this is crazy
Yeah.
making.
No. But this what is just coming to mind again is how religion allows people to justify their bigotry towards marginalized communities.
Yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
that's why, and even just that, as I mentioned earlier about just people of color, of how it's been used to oppress, very much bring in like women, and how I believe religion has been used against women and to oppress women and to kind of put them in a role.
Yeah,
I mean, we can even get to the core of the whole where we take Adam as the first one, and it's just like, even when they want to say like, oh, but they took it from the rib, it's the middle. We're still putting the guy first. How did that
yeah.
happen? Like, and is it not a coincidence that a bunch of guys wrote this?
Well, and the thing, but then I still go back to, sure, a bunch of men, historically, there's no arguing that, wrote the Bible. But when you look at how even Jesus was represented, of like giving honor to women and
Mm-hmm.
and seeing women where they were, like, that's why I can fall back to the fact that I love who Jesus is. Like, I love who he represents. I love how he like pursued the marginalized. I love how he listened and encouraged and told stories that like made people like grow into the best versions of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I think so many pieces of the Bible are like picked and chosen to, like, I mean, because that's my mom's big thing is too. I mean, she's very much like an active feminist, and I mean, I am too. And so when she like argues the Bible, I'm like, but if we just look at who Jesus is and like how he lived and like who he sought after, like that's the problem. Like people are the problem.
Yeah. Well, to me, it goes back to the giant sign in front that says "Love one another." That's why it's like, if
Yeah,
people just loved one another and loved their God, that's
yeah,
cool. We would have a
right.
lot
And I
less
don't have to.
issues.
I don't have to. That's like where my daughter got so stuck on this witchcraft thing the other day. I'm like,
Well,
I don't like, even if I don't believe in it, it could still be true. And
well,
like, who am I?
uh,
Like,
and one of the big things that I learned when I separated myself from the church was that the reason I celebrated Jesus, the reason I honored the Ten Commandments and those specific phrases and things like that, is because of the community I grew up in. Had I been grown up in another part of the world, I could be practicing witchcraft. And in separating myself from the church, what I learned is I didn't discover any faith that told people to be a jerk. There really
yeah,
isn't any faith out there that says be a jerk to other
no,
people.
yeah.
People
But like,
justify all the
why
other
are so
components.
many Christians
And
jerks?
even I remember looking into Satanism. Not even that
Yeah,
says be a jerk to others.
right.
One of the key components that I remember is they're not big on turning the other cheek. That was one thing. It's like, okay, we're not going to turn the other cheek, but one of the big things, it doesn't mean be a jerk to other people. So I love this idea, going back to people going into kind of more of this concept of spirituality and it being much more of an independent thing. Because, like, as I said, like, the whole resurrection story is not original. There are so many stories before Jesus, and that was one of the big things. Is the deeper I got into studying religion, the more I learned that Christianity was a mix up of a lot of other religions. And that just makes sense, because as you're taking other people's culture away from them, the easiest way to make them celebrate your culture is by incorporating pieces of theirs. So you
I'll have to
incorporate
look
little
more into that.
things. Yeah, and that is a big thing. There's a lot of Christianity is taken from a lot of other religions.
Okay.
And as you see it move into other cultures, you see how it ultimately adapted to take little pieces from it so that it's easier
So you
ultimately
can
for that.
more easily assimilate, huh?
Yeah. Um, so even a lot of the cultures of where I think, one of the things that I need to look deeper into, but like Mexico's a large celebration of like La Virgen Maria.
Mm-hmm.
just, motherly. Looking back into a lot of the roots of Mexican culture, the African indigenous sides were more matriarchal.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
doesn't it make sense that we'd also start celebrating a virgin in a more matriarchal image as
Yeah.
part of our cultural identity?
Huh.
And how we bring but again, the little components need to kind of be brought in to be that, because I mean, the culture needs to be killed off slowly.
Yeah.
But it is
So
like
it's not
interesting.
like, yeah. So many things to think about here.
Yes. And we definitely got into a lot of future topics as far
Yeah.
as
Set the
identity.
stage for
So
that.
as far as I know, we've discussed how, it relates specifically to identity and the queer community.
Mm-hmm.
That can definitely be a much deeper conversation. Um, to discussing of how I thought I grew up like middle class, and how a lot of that too was growing up. I thought my conditions were God's will, and being able to justify systemic issues because they're happening because clearly God wants them that way. And again, seeing ways of how religion is ultimately utilized to oppress people, and specifically the marginalized communities.
Yeah. And easy for me to not necessarily, I don't, I mean, I like to think that I'm not dismissive, but easy for me to not have to acknowledge being a straight passing middle class white woman.
Hmm.
More so, I guess, if I were a man, but yeah, lots
When
of things to come.
yeah, one of the big things that I want to mention just before we go, where one of the luxuries I miss, because I do feel it was a luxury of when I was religion, I could feel a sense of comfort feeling that all of this mess was in someone else's hands. It's a lot more pressure to know that a lot of the situations we're in are in our hands. We've created this, we've allowed these things to happen, it's our hands. And that's where I also worry about religious religion's impact on society, of how certain injustices are allowed to exist because we think that they're part of God's plan, or God wants them this way, or things like that, versus really looking into it and saying, no, where these things are happening because we've allowed them. No one else is guiding this ship. We are. Um, so
Mm.
another big component that's been kind of uh, on my mind a lot lately, of just
Yeah.
the responsibility and the putting on myself because of that, and how I didn't have it as much before.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
it set the stage for a lot of good things to come.
yes. So hopefully you enjoyed our longest episode ever. We thought it needed a lot of time, because as you can see, it
I
delved
struggle
into.
summarizing.
Yeah, well, that I didn't anticipate that, honestly, but it did.
Really?
It did bring up, no, not 20 minutes worth. Uh, it did bring up kind of a lot of future topics, and a lot of the concepts I did want to discuss, because one of the ones that I did want to discuss was how I feel it taught me homophobia, and it allowed me to use it to justify that hatred and my actions, and how I see that in society as well. But thank you all. If you liked the longer episode, let us know. These might be harder to do. We knew this one because of the content, but again, if you like anything, you dislike something, I'm sure those people will let us know.
Yeah.
Um, but
Shocking.
like and subscribe, share if anything we say you think might be relatable or connect with someone. But thank you all. We hope to see you in 2 weeks. Again, as always, wishing you all peace, love, and power. Hope to see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.